The movie opens with Chris Pratt, the main character, speeding down the road in his car, having fun with his friends and his girlfriend, Kelly. Everyone inside is drunk and painting the town red. Chris turns off the headlights to make the most of the night, while the fireflies are illuminating the sky. Danny and his girlfriend ask Chris to turn the lights back on, but he ignores them and speeds up instead. Without lights, the car crashes into a truck. In this tragic accident, Danny and his girlfriend lose their lives. 4 years later, Chris wakes up to his morning alarm. In a voiceover, he explains that he sometimes cries for no reason, but we know he still couldn't forgive himself for the horrific crash that killed his friends. He continues to beat himself up and keeps a notebook with a to-do list. After class ends at the skill center, Chris heads to his car and realizes he left the keys inside. He removes his shoe, pulls out a spare key, and unlocks the door. Next, he sits with a sad face, watching children play ice hockey at the rink. He spots Kelly passing by but can't pluck up the courage to confront her. Afterward, he arrives at a coffee shop and meets Janet, his case manager. She asks if he's having any sequencing or memory issues. He replies no, but Janet notices him struggling to hold his spoon. Chris tries to hit on her by asking her to a movie, but his heart breaks when she refuses.
I didn't mean it like that. I know. You're not a stranger. I have a relationship with you.
He then returns home heartbroken. Chris checks his voicemail and hears from his billionaire father, Robert Pratt, inviting him home for Thanksgiving. He starts preparing tomato soup, but grows frustrated when he can't find the can opener. So he calls his visually impaired roommate and best friend Lewis to ask where the can opener is, but Lewis doesn't answer as Chris was being offensive on the line. Lewis returns home from work and calls for Chris. He moves to the room and stumbles upon a can of food. He picks it up and places it on the counter while Chris sits depressed on the floor. Lewis prepares dinner for both of them and lightens Chris's mood. That night, Chris arrives at Knoll State Bank and Trust where he works as a teller. He meets Mrs. Line, a bank employee, who tells him the boss is in a bad mood. Chris laughs it off and enters the bank. Mr. Tuttle, Chris's boss, explains that harvest checks go out in a week, so the bank faces a rush in the coming weeks. He tells Chris to prepare for extra cleaning. Chris cleans the women's bathroom and makes a to-do list of tasks. While mopping the floor, he plays ice hockey with the mop in its bucket, recalling his days as a great player. Meanwhile, a car parks outside the bank. Inside, Gary Spargo and his minion, Bones, sit and stalk Chris. After work, Chris visits a bar to lighten his mind and orders a pint of beer. A young, attractive woman passes by while gazing at him. Gary Spargo arrives and hits on a girl at the bar counter while Chris listens attentively. Chris pulls out his notebook and writes down Gary's words. Gary strikes up a conversation, saying he knows Chris from school. He was a couple of years ahead of Chris's sister, Allison. The bartender charges Chris $2.50 for a drink, and gullible Chris pays, but Gary intervenes, scolds the bartender for charging a $17 tip for a $3 beer, and saves Chris from being overcharged. This befriends them. Gary mentions hearing about Chris's accident that ended his ice hockey career. Chris explains he crashed into a stalled combine on a dark road 4 years ago, losing 2 friends. Gary uses an inhaler, and Chris watches closely. The same girl who passed by earlier secretly glances at Chris while playing billiards. Gary points it out, says goodbye, and leaves after whispering to some men at the bar. Next, Chris arrives home for Thanksgiving dinner with Lewis. Lewis enjoys the savory food, but Chris feels uncomfortable around his family. Lewis tells Mr. Robert Pratt, Chris's father, that Chris plans to open a restaurant soon, but Robert dislikes the idea. Chris asks his sister Allison if she knows Gary Spargo. She says yes.
You remember Gary Spargo?
Who? You probably did.
Chris plays chess with his father and loses easily.
In fact, checkmate. Hey, come on, we got time for another quick one.
I think I can't play chess anymore.
Happy Thanksgiving, son.
Back at the bank, amicable Deputy Ted drops by with a box of donuts. He reminds Chris to lock the back door properly and leaves.
Yeah, right, only we don't refer to it as the baby. Not even born yet, I'm already awake all night. Remember, lock the back door.
I thought I was good looking.
Chris Pratt?
Chris returns to the bar and the same charming girl approaches, asking if he is Chris Pratt. He replies yes. She then says her family wants to buy him a drink. The girl reveals herself as Lovely, trying to come closer to Chris. Gary suggests they go to a quiet place upstairs with no noise. There, they see Gary making love to a woman. Overwhelmed, Chris and Lovely get intimate on the couch. Later, Gary drops Chris home and asks how his billionaire father, Robert Pratt, feels about him living there. Chris says he doesn't know. Before leaving, Gary invites him to his farm for Thanksgiving dinner if he wants. Chris enters the house and goes to Lewis's room. Lewis smells perfume and realizes Chris slept with a woman.
Son of a bitch. Come here. At least tell me your name.
Lovely.
Chris avoids Lewis's friendly interrogation, but Lewis insists on the woman's name. Chris says Lovely. Lewis finds the name sketchy and asks how they met. Chris explains Gary Spargo introduced her to him at the bar.
Do I know this guy?
Chris goes to sleep while Lewis remains suspicious. The next day, Chris arrives at Gary's farm for Thanksgiving dinner. Lovely embraces him warmly. Gary introduces him to his friends. Chris enjoys the party and passes out after too much drinking. Moments later, he wakes up and follows the sounds downstairs. There, he sees Gary's project map on the wall. Gary says he has been on it for months. Chris zooms in and spots several banks. He asks why Gary photographs them. Gary admits he plans to rob them. Stunned, Chris pulls back. Gary clarifies he targets corporations robbing innocent farmers. Chris sees his bank on the map and feels betrayed. Gary asks for his help. Chris refuses, but Gary promises to restore everything he lost, saying money equals power. Gary notes Chris's father pays for his care, but never gives him independence.
Who pays for your life? Where's that money come from? I mean, you drive a car, and given your track history, it must be more than the rent. Which money to take care of you? But you won't give me enough money to take care of you. Doles out enough money so that
My father would give me money if I asked him.
Now ask him for one.
Chris doesn't verify it and leaves. Lewis and Chris apply for a $30,000 bank loan to open a restaurant. The loan officer dislikes Lewis's sandwich names, inspired by admired people. Lewis offers to name one after him. Outside, Chris spots Kelly but can't approach her. That night, Chris calls his father for $1,000. Robert beats around the bush and indirectly refuses. The next morning, Chris follows an armored truck and decides to help Gary rob his bank. Deputy Ted arrives with donuts while Chris photographs the vault. Ted asks why. Chris says his parents want to see where he works. Ted then takes the camera, poses Chris by the vault, and snaps a photo. At Gary's farm, Gary and his crew plan to crack the vault.
No one's gonna hear anything anyway. What about cameras? Your job will be watch
Gary
out.
assigns Chris to watch for Deputy Ted, who patrols unpredictably. That night, Chris returns home with Lovely. They make love. Chris falls asleep exhausted. Lovely enters Lewis's room, unaware he's awake.
Offer you some pies. Not homemade, but it's decent.
Anymore. I was never very good at it.
She waves her hand in front of his face to test his blindness. Lewis stops her and demands her real name. Lovely dodges, but Lewis presses her on her motives.
Some buddies and me wanted to make money. Why are you here?
The same reason you are. Gary?
Well, I've known lots of Garys. True. You love. But that brings me back to that original question. What are you doing here?
Chris watches a truck unload cash at his bank and immediately informs Gary. Patrolling Ted drops by with donuts, but Chris rudely tells him not to check on the bank. Ted says he comes for Chris's sake. Chris returns the donuts and says not to pity him. Before leaving, Mr. Tuttle tells Chris to lock the door carefully. Chris quickly locks the door and calls Gary and tells him that he will not help him rob the bank. Gary's gang arrives anyway. Chris refuses to help and promises silence, but Gary forces him inside. Marty and Gary crack the vault while Chris watches the door. Cork spots Ted outside and alerts them. Gary holds Chris at gunpoint and makes him talk normally to Ted. Ted shares he became a father and will be replaced by Deputy Philip Costello tomorrow. Chris apologizes for his rudeness. Ted forgives him and leaves for his wife, unaware of the heist. He stops for donuts for Chris. Marty opens the vault and spots several cameras inside, so they force Chris inside to grab the cash.
Okay.
Go and get it.
They load bags into the car. Meanwhile, Ted returns to give donuts to Chris. Ted knocks on the door, but Chris doesn't answer it. Teddy turns suspicious and approaches the door. There he spots Gary's reflection. Bone realizes that the deputy has learned about their presence inside the bank, so he shoots, but Ted dodges. In the fierce shootout, Ted kills Marty and gravely wounds Gary.
Hold the shotgun! Hold the shotgun! There's another!
Ted fights bravely, but Bone shoots him in the back.
Open the boat.
However, Chris tried to warn him, but Ted didn't hear. Seizing the chance, Chris steals Gary's car loaded with cash and flees. Speeding, he cries over the past accident, revealing that he couldn't forgive himself to this day. A cop pulls him over for no lights. Chris shows his license and registration, then the cop lets him go. In a quiet spot, Chris checks the overflowing cash bags. He parks outside his home and calls Lewis, who tells him that Gary has captured him. Gary grabs the phone and offers Chris for a peaceful talk. In the meantime, Bone arrives, causing Chris to flee in a split second. Chris then comes to his family home with the bags. He writes a to-do list: save Lewis, kill Bone first, then kill Gary. He hides his father's shotgun in a bag, then calls Gary to meet him at 6 p.m. by the mayor's Christmas tree and asks him to bring Lewis along if he wants his money back. Chris buries the bags under snow at 24 West and dozes off, dreaming of Kelly.
It's about time.
Yeah, I wanted to. I've been wanting to.
I miss you.
You're not mad at me anymore? Let's see what?
It's part of me now.
Bone ambushes him at gunpoint and pulls him out of the car. They demand the money spot, but Chris denies knowing. Gary pulls out Chris's notebook and finds old 24 West, where Chris has hidden his money. Moments later, they arrive at the spot, and Chris begins to dig out the bags amid Gary's shivering as he desperately needs his inhaler. Chris tosses one bag. Bone carries it to the car as Gary worsens in the cold. After recovering his money, Bone aims at Lewis to blow his head off, unaware that Chris also has a shotgun. Chris kills Bone before he could kill his friend. Then he approaches Gary, who desperately tries to reach for his inhaler, but can't make it to the inhaler and dies.
Once upon a time,
Chris returns the money and confesses his part, but the FBI frees him as evidence proves he was coerced. Through a voiceover, Chris says he opened a restaurant with Mr. Tuttle's loan. He skates again, not as good as before, but okay with it. He sees Kelly and hopes she'll one day hear what he only says in dreams. In the end, Chris and Lewis are seen heading to their restaurant.